we've been trying to reflect on the intellectual lineages, the concepts, also the potential for critique of IPS in different instances and publications. The Winter School is a project that began in 2010. Actually, it began as a workshop, a doctoral workshop in IPS, in International Political Sociology. It was organized jointly by Didier Bigot, Rob Walker, who is here with us, Mike Shapiro, myself, among others. Jef was also part of that initial project. Beto Yamato is here with us today as well. So that roving workshop took place between 2010, 2014. And it was a very interesting consortium of different international institutions, university institutions, that tried to cooperate along the lines of joint cooperation, exchange, scholarship between students and faculty in these institutions: University of Hawaii, University of Victoria, PUC-Rio, King's College, London, and Sciences Po initially, and then afterwards joined by Queen Mary University of London. So the doctoral workshop became the IPS Winter School, which takes place annually in Rio, also with the partnership with other institutions since 2015. So this is the 6th edition of the Winter School. It's an international event. It's mostly focused on South American or Latin American publics. So the way to engage in the reflection from South America, Latin America, and how you can make IPS and international studies a more global affair, if you like, or having a wider reach than its initial, mostly European roots, European, North American roots, Anglo-Saxon roots of the field, but IPS is no exception in that way. So this is more or less the proposal of the school. We're hoping next year we'll go back to the in-person model. So I'd like to then introduce our panelists for today, and also thank Rob for being here. Hi, Rob. He will be with Didier and Oli Weaver in the panel tomorrow. But I'd like to thank very much Oliver Kessler from the University of Erfurt, who is here thinking together with us about the trajectories of IPS. Oliver has published extensively also in the journal, in IPS itself, since the beginning, and has always followed with interest how the field has evolved. And he will talk about that in this panel today. Jef Huysmans from the Queen Mary University of London is here with us. He's professor of politics over there. He's a colleague and a friend. We've been working together for a long time, and he's become part of the Winter School project in the past few years, and has helped me and Beto organize this program, this year's program. This year's program is a reduced program. It's only 4 days. It's usually 2 weeks. So it's more of an immersion experience in scholarship, exchange, collegiality, and so forth. It's a school, a 2-week experience. Really, this year, obviously we couldn't do it, but we hope to get back to that same format, or maybe with some adaptations next year. And you're welcome to apply next year for a different kind of experience. So we hope you enjoy today's panel, and we welcome you to participate. I see we have over 100 people here with us today. Perhaps the best way to participate is through the chat, in this case, right? Instead of through raising hand. It might be more complicated if we raise hands. So please participate through the chat. So we'll give 20 minutes each as a starting point. We'll begin with Oliver, and then I will go after Oliver, and then Jef. Okay, Oliver, thanks again for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to this fascinating venue. What I will do in the next, well, we thought 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes maybe, is to structure like twofold. The first is that there is an overall structure of my talk in the sense of before, present, and probable future of IPS. So what I want to do is also to look at how IPS emerged as a field of study and probably why, what the promises were, because that maybe gives us an idea whether these promises are currently pursued, or to what extent they're being pursued, or to what extent there is a shift, or to what extent maybe there is also a rupture, a break, or to what the possible excluded or future avenues might look like. Yeah, the other is that I want to present a couple of numbers and a couple of graphs that I'm doing at the moment, where we look at the Journal of International Political Sociology and how it has evolved since its inception. Because at the moment, I think, and João already hinted to that, you cannot actually talk about, well, there is a certain closeness in how you address the field of study, international political sociology, and the journal, International Political Sociology, with the same name, which are closely connected and which stand in a very, very particular relationship. So that might be something to be addressed later on. So what the relationship of the journal and the section in the ISA with the field of study is, and to what extent there are other venues or possibilities. So I have to, as a caveat, these numbers are very preliminary. They haven't been published. We are in the midst of actually calibrating and doing recalculations and figuring out whether it all makes sense. But I just thought that this might be a first opportunity to give us some kind of idea where we're going and how the journal itself is changing. Now, let me go before, because as I hate to admit it, I probably am reaching an age where I can tell I was there before IPS was around as a field of study. And that's what it feels like when you grow old. So as I can remember, and we always know that memory is partly biased and partly maybe not an adequate representation of what really happened, but there were in the late 80s, early 90s, then there were emerging new trajectories or approaches within international relations that have not been called international political sociology, but that I think are important for understanding why IPS came into being. There is, of course, the entire post-structuralist critique with their focus on representations, othering, difference, and modes of inclusion and exclusion, where, of course, the literature around Foucault and Derrida has been very instructive in the beginning. We saw the advent of various sorts of constructivist scholarship with their interests, well, back then in, well, it says, well, I would say speech acts and the intersubjective constitution of meaning, where questions of identity and questions of, well, later on norms and ideas and agent structure has been addressed. And of course, there was the feminist critique early on, which hinted and rightly pointed out that at the moment how IR was being done addressed only a small fraction of political processes that are important for understanding how international processes actually work. I think IPS came into being as a venue because, or let me say that, all three, in a sense, shared an understanding that it doesn't make sense anymore to address international processes in terms of an absence of social categories, or that an analogy to the Hobbesian state of nature is not taking us very far when it comes to understanding current politics in the 21st or in the late 20s, early 21st century. That raises, of course, the question, what kind of concept of the social is actually adequate for understanding international processes? And here, I think IPS came into being as the venue, as the opportunity to address exactly that question. And early on, I think that was one of the questions that was heavily debated, also across various sociological traditions and notions of social. Because, I mean, as simple as the social might be, I think there are innumerous understandings, approaches, and concepts of what the social is and how we best address it. It's the same with culture. I mean, it's so simple at the same time, so complex to think about what culture could or could not mean. So IPS for me is early on this promise of thinking about the social, but with it came another promise, which I think is related, but which goes together. And I think, and Rob is here, which came out very, very distinctively in the first editorial journal, International Political Sociology, where I say, well, if we want to understand the social within the international, we cannot just simply go back to the classics and apply them. It's not just about go back to Weber, Simmel, to Durkheim, and all those great dinosaurs of social theory, and just think they already had the answer, because most of their concepts of the social, as has been pointed out back then, was somehow framed, built, and structured with the nation state in mind. So just to apply that to the social beyond the nation state might lead us into category mistakes of the first order. So what we need first is to explore actually what kind of social can we actually, or what notion of the social is actually possible, or how is it possible to think about the social beyond the nation state when at the same time the entire socio-political vocabulary is structured by the nation state. So the nation state comes in as soon as we talk about politics or the social. With that comes the second promise, because what I think then was related is that we need a different way of organizing our knowledge and a different way of interdisciplinary research when we want to take the challenge of IPS seriously. And IPS as a journal had this promise to foster and bring together scholars from various traditions and disciplinary backgrounds to talk about these challenges and the transformations of international as we saw them. Now, in my understanding, and please correct me if you think and disagree, the challenge that was posed early on in the early 2000s when the journal came into being was that we cannot just go back to the sociological tradition, or we cannot go back to classical political theory, but somehow we have to read the politics within the kind of politics that the classical sociological approaches might allow us to address. So to read sociology as political theory, or to read political theory as social theory. And you see that the organization in the various disciplines, or the way in which knowledge is structured, has this particular very specific blind spot, because it's very hard to think about the social and political theory together. If you, and I mean, there are a couple of sociological masters like Habermas or Luhmann, people I worked with, who were banging their heads against this question for the last 50 years. So, I mean, the question is probably not to find the ultimate solution, but to get the question right and actually have this space to talk about it. Now, what has happened is, and here I want to try to share the screen. And as I said, there are many, many graphs because we're in the midst of actually preparing them. I won't go into all of them, but probably just to give you an idea of how the evolution of the journal actually looked like. So if I can now, again, share the screen. Can you see that? You see, and that's because we do this, we approach the transformation of IPS, a field of study, through the journal. And it's, let me be blunt and let me be very, very specific. It's not about criticizing the editors or saying that they misunderstood the question or that, but there is an evolutionary tendency and there are changes, and maybe the editors share their experience about how it is possible, or how at the same time, at that period, debates evolved, the kind of manuscripts that they received. I mean, you cannot publish manuscripts that you don't get. I mean, there is this kind of structural limit to that. But I will now try to skip through, oops, I need to push here. What we try to do is to actually link all the journals that IPS has been cited and look at how the journals cite IPS papers. This is incomprehensible, even after hours, so I don't want to go into details. But you see, I mean, these graphs try to tell you how the importance of journals change over time. I won't go into details as there as well, because where I want to draw your attention to is a set of graphs that start here, where in the beginning, you see that IPS is embedded somehow in a very loose network. Of course, it's starting. I mean, the first issues take inspiration from all you have, but you see that there is an evolutionary tendency. I mean, you see, for example, ethnography, cultural conflicts. I mean, we know where this is coming from. Alternatives, we probably also know where this is coming from. But also International Studies Quarterly, Millennium, World Politics. The Americans are linked, the World American Political Science Review, which probably links us to the paper by John Mayer and the Stanford School. We're still looking into the numbers and the exact papers, but you see that over the years, there is a change where increasingly a link is established to, and that's the only point that I try to convey, to more geographical journals, and in particular, well, if you, oops, that's the, so we see today more and more links to geographical journals, but in particular, if you take all the issues and all the links over the years, not just over the years, you see a very close link to security dialogue, which has emerged over the years, which was not present in the beginning, but you see that happening after 2000, in the last couple of years. So the link to security dialogue and to geography it's getting stronger. And for me, it tells me, and I'm provocative maybe at this point, is that IPS at the moment looks to me more like European critical security studies publishing in an American journal than actually addressing the key questions of social theory. You also see that in terms of the in the maps of the key terms in IPS, you see a certain network about identity and citizenship, of governmentality and migration, on violence and subjectivity, and in a more production, knowledge, society, and discipline, which is all fine. It's not a critique, but it tells you that there are certain clusters within IPS which are more targeted and more addressed, I think, in the traditions of critical security studies than within the traditions of classical social theory, as you may have it. If it comes to lineages, I mean, traced here the 60 most cited papers and looked at who refers to whom over the years. And we may calibrate that over, but you see in the beginning, 2007, 2008, I mean, there is a certain tradition which is around Jäger, Albert, Hindres, Brenner, which is more world systems, Luhmann, Habermas, all various over there. And that problem, that essentially dies out in 2014. And there is a tradition which I think goes from Bigot, but Bigot somehow seems, I mean, also less of an importance, and more you see practice theories and critical security as key drivers or mostly cited authors within IPS. As I said, this is not a critique, but this is something that is happening, I think, and where IPS has shifted its attention. So this is incomprehensible. I don't want to tell you more about it, but what has not happened, obviously, in IPS is that sociological journals don't play a major role. American Journal of Sociology is not important for IPS. The European journals of sociology are not in IPS. And it has to be admitted that these journals don't take notice of IPS as a journal. So the premise of interdisciplinary research somehow looks to me at the moment a bit unexplored. Or let's say there is a lot of room of improvement, and it doesn't seem to be a major problem today in how actually IPS, as a different way of organizing knowledge, is actually operating. So what's the future? Well, I mean, in the sense that will continue, and probably the questions of critical security and the link of European networks of critical security and IPS becomes stronger. But that comes with certain limitations, because then the key question of what the social is in an international setting, or what the adequate notion of the social can be, is already solved, because you already have the answers by invoking a certain tradition. The debate between, as an exchange among various traditions, is not taking place. And I think the challenge of reading sociology as political theory or political theory as social theory is still open and still to be had. Whether IPS is the venue to have that debate, I would like to explore that with the past and current editors of IPS, because I'm curious of what they think. With that, I thank you for your patience and give the word back to you, João. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oliver, for this really interesting survey and analysis of the trajectory of IPS. I think it's going to be a good basis for our discussion. So before turning to Jef, I will give a few remarks on the history and on the contributions of IPS, and offer a few topics for debate. I think one of the ideas of these panels is to discuss as much as possible and as openly as possible what IPS has to contribute and what are its shortcomings and potentials. So in terms of the history, and I hope we'll have more input on the actual history of the field and the journal tomorrow with Rob and Didier, as well as Ule. I think in my case, the history of IPS is very closely linked to the critical IR field. I think I wouldn't situate so much the emergence of IPS as an attempt or as an effort to address the exigencies of transdisciplinarity. I think transdisciplinarity is certainly part of the intellectual tradition of IPS, and perhaps even more an effect of the move IPS produces within the field of IR. But clearly, IPS is strongly inscripted in the discipline of international studies. And it tries to reframe the discipline, bringing in a lot of different intellectual contributions, but mostly in trying to rethink the limits of the international and, of course, the boundaries, the disciplinary boundaries between IR and other social science and humanities fields of knowledge. So I think that's the main interest, I think, in IPS, is that it creates the conditions to articulate a critique, not from within the field of IR, so a critique to IR as a field of knowledge, but also a broader critique, I would say, of how we think about politics and how we think about social in the social sciences and the humanities in general. So taking a bit of Rob Walker's contribution to the field, I would say that it allows, IPS allows to create a space within IR to think the political from the international, or to think international relations as political theory. Of course, that comes from Rob Walker's approach to the field, which is strongly rooted in political theory. But IPS has also, the strong influence of critical sociology that actually introduce a lot of very interesting concepts, a lot of innovative ways to analyze processes and to think the international through other mapping devices, such as fields, networks, and so forth, that actually dealt with the limits of the international in a different way. I think it opened a lot of possibilities to introduce processes that were strongly excluded from international political analysis into international studies, especially into critical international studies, such as the study of borders, the study of policing, the study of all kinds of rankings, the role of numbers, and so forth. Many of actually sociological problems were actually made problems analyzed by IPS through the conjugation of these two, perhaps these two perspectives, which perhaps don't cohere in the first place, a strong emphasis in international political theory and a strong emphasis in critical sociology. One clearly pointing to the limits of the international as a way to think about politics, and hence, and as a lineage, strong lineage of critique of the poverty of international relations in the political science tradition. And the other, thinking about this more dynamic element, if you want, of actually thinking about the openings which you can find if you look at processes that might perhaps, and that's the potential of many sociological traditions, to perhaps breach the rigidity, if you want, of the disciplinary, but also other boundaries that constitute the modern international. So that was, I think, the initial challenge. And I remember being at the first meeting of the editorial board in San Diego in 2006, if I remember well. And the room was filled with, I don't know, maybe close to 100 people. I can't remember. Maybe I'm overthinking this, over exaggerating the number, but clearly 50, 60 people. And if you looked at who was there, it was perhaps all of the field of critical IR. The critical term was all there. So my take on IPS is that most of the shortcomings that perhaps many of the shortcomings, perhaps pointed by Oliver in his talk, have to do with the place from where it was articulated in the first place. Which is interesting because both Didier Bigot and Rob Walker were surely very interested in the processes that was undergoing in the discipline, but they were clearly not really outsiders, because they're not really outsiders, but they sat in marginal places in the field of IR as it was structured then. And they were not particularly sympathetic to, for instance, theories of IR in how they were formulated in the first place. They were looking more on how to overcome its limits. But by articulating the project the way they did, they made way to a lot of, I think, maybe I'm overstating this, but it made way to a lot of research agendas that started to brew within the critical turn in the 80s and the 90s, and then diversified and prospered in the new cycle of, research fostered not just by IPS, but critical security studies, border studies, citizenship studies, and so forth. But I do situate not just the conditions for this knowledge to prosper, but also the institutional conditions, not just in the journals, but also in the politics of the field. The emergence of IPS was determinant to shift a lot of processes that were going on, a lot of balances, or actually destabilize a lot of power structures within the field, and open a lot of possibilities for the people who are now populating this growing. I mean, it's become a huge universe of all kinds of different lineages that study the international not as something that limits politics between the national, the global, and the international, but something that cuts across different spaces and different places. So very, very important contribution to critique. And that's in terms of my reading of the history, which is maybe a bit heterodox. But I think Oliver is right in pointing to the question of the social as a very important question in even the initial debates in IR, not just in IPS, but in IR in general at that time. And this perhaps is something that we might discuss further I think. Maybe Jef can talk a little bit about this. That's something that perhaps hasn't been pursued with the same conceptual rigor, if you want, or at least conceptual creativity, if you like, more in the last 10 years, if you like, than in the first 5-6 years of the journal. I'm talking here about the journal, of course, because this was intensely discussed in the journal in the first 5 or 6 years. The question of the social, along with the question of the global. So I think that's important. In terms of lineages, and clearly, I would say that not thinking about the founding figures of IPS, but thinking about the field as a whole, because the field is populated by dozens, now hundreds of people that have very, very important role in changing the field of IR. So in terms of thinking about them, I would say that post-structuralism was very important to think both about critique, about the limits of the international, and about structure, and how to deal with the rigidity of structures and look at practices, subjectivity, and somehow agency. So how to get out of the traps of structure agency debates in mainstream IR. And because post-structuralism is so important for many of those who participated in the emergence of the field, the question of limits becomes very important. And clearly here, the problem of boundaries and borders is intensely researched and reflected upon in all of the history of IPS. And it has been, hence all the advances in migration studies and surveillance and policing. And that comes a lot from the critique of sovereignty and the critique of the limits of sovereignty, or the sovereign imagination, if you like, to rethink the international. So that's clearly one central point, the problem of how limits create the possibility to think about the international, but at the same time, the international itself as an expression of the possibilities created by these limits, right, makes it impossible to overcome them. So the international becomes this dispositive to reproduce limits that does not allow for reaching the promise it states, which is overcoming the particularities of and the situatedness of the modern condition. And the other problem is the one of structure, and we've discussed this with Jef extensively in other papers, in a couple of articles we've published in the journal. And here the problem of structure, I think, was articulated, and here is a problem that we've raised in these two papers. The structure was read a lot from the perspective of what American IR conceived of the structure of the international system. And here there's perhaps a break, an important break, at least in public debate and the more heated discussions and debates of the critical turn. That leads to an anti-structuralism, I would say, in a lot of people from the critical turn, and of course, in IPS. So the issue of structure, because it's associated to neorealism, basically, to structural realism, and to the American formulation of what a structure does and what a structure is, distances a lot of these intellectual expressions of IPS from the whole discussion about structuring, except when criticizing globality as some kind of different governmental structure. But it's mostly through the thinking of fields and the thinking of governmentality, Foucault, Bourdieu, and others, that you start thinking the international not from the perspective of structure, but rather through a perspective of very decentered power relations, fragmented power relations, a relationality that lacks centers of gravity. And because structure is in many ways, at least in many formulations, a concept that describes distributions, of course, of power, but surely homeostatic tendencies in social fields or in social formations. The whole concept of structure is forgotten in IPS. Jef and I have tried to reflect on the concept of structure, not so much as this stabilizing device, this anti-historic, anti-political form of thinking, but rather structure as a way of organizing difference, of expressing multiplicity in a certain way of organizing relations. That does not necessarily imply or mean a static conception of the social and the political. So the break between many IPS intellectuals and structure and the idea of structure led, I would say, in a certain way, with a certain distancing also from the lineage of post-structuralism, which is strongly inscribed in, of course, linguistic structuralism, but also in the rethinking of structure by Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and others. And I think that's a problem to think about the social as well. So if you look at the evolution, and the other question we have made to the panelists, if you look at the evolution of the field more recently, is that in the last, how can I say, 10 years perhaps, right? That this gradually moves away first from the problem of the global and globality. It formulates an important critique of globality in its first decade or so. So the question of global and globalization is firmly addressed and left behind, so to speak, right? In many works in the journal, and it moves away also from the question of the international. The international becomes something that's in the background, and that was the intent of IPS, to provide a critique of the international as a way of thinking about politics, and to move beyond the limits of thinking politics through the dualities of that category of the modern international. And it moves into thinking about, the fragmented world, if you want, of the social, right? Through the lenses of security, citizenship, policing, terrorism, humanitarianism, and so forth, right? The problem, of course, is moving away from the international sometimes reserved a few traps. So you have to think about boundaries as places where politics occurs, and the practices of boundary making and border producing are practices that are at the basis of the genesis of the international as a way of thinking about politics. But at the same time, you have to move beyond or think about space differently and about politics differently. So the thing is, how do these things stand together, right? The critique of the international, which needs to be reinstated all the time because you're critiquing boundary making practices. So the international is still there. And the analysis of all these decentered social formations or political formations that characterize the fragmenting of the international itself. So the international is still a conceptual necessity, if you like, or at the starting point from where to think about international political sociology, or where to think, how to think about a fragmented or fractured world. So we cannot clearly escape the international. And because we've moved away from that concept, or distance ourselves from that concept, because at some point it became overdetermined by globality and so forth, we perhaps left behind the possibilities of thinking the political sociology of the international in a more consistent way, I would say. So the challenge that we're facing now is how to reintroduce the problem of the international without letting go of the fracturing disposition of IPS. And there's lots of important contributions to that, lots. Many of them don't raise the problem of the international as it was raised in 2006-07, but many of them make important contributions to that. And I think one of the challenges is to perhaps frame the debate, bring those debates that are going on in many different areas of IPS to the question of the international. And here I'm going to conclude. Why do we have to go back to the problem of the international? Well, because the international is coming back at us, I would say. And how is it coming back at us? Through the reintroduction of large frames of analysis to think about the current condition. Geopolitics, global capitalism, right? Global assemblages, global fascism. I mean, all of these big categories, and the state for sure, are being brought back in to think about the possibilities of sometimes resistance, right? Or to pursue even further a more integrated world society, to pursue multilateralism, to perfection humanitarianism and so forth. So the project of the global is always there. The thing is that many in the critical side think that in order to face the challenge of critique of liberalism on the one side, global neoliberalism or whatever, and the emerging conservative right, you have to go back to some way of totalizing what capitalism has become or the international system has become to formulate another critique. And that's when the international creeps in back in, and reinstates the old dualities that makes us think the way we've been thinking throughout all modernity. Thanks, that's it. Now I leave the floor to Jef.
Thanks, João. I don't know anymore what to contribute now. Let's see where we go. I mean, the question of the social, I will leave that for the discussion. I think I might come back to that one. I think that's a very important one. And I like the way Oliver set out the constructivism, post-structuralism, feminist kind. And then what was not included there, which, you know, some form of historical materialism wasn't there, and the Gramscians weren't there, and so on, the historical sociologists were there and not there. So it's quite interesting to see how the field constituted itself at that point in time. The other bit that João ended up with, how the international comes back to us, of course, that remains, to some extent, IPS had originally an answer to this, I think, how you can study the international as one part of sub-projects, which was that it was a political sociology of the international, which actually was where you started thinking international as a specific set of practices that existed, which you then could sociologically research right? You know, in the olden days, you would study diplomacy as the representation of the international, you would study that. So it wouldn't encompass everything. It would just be a particular kind of instituted practices. Like in law, it would be carried by particular categories of lawyers who formed the field of international law that then became the international, and you could study it. So it is a different, in some way, it keeps the international as a practice rather than the organizing category through which you think that encompasses all political relations that you want to look at. But that doesn't solve, of course, the problem then about how can you think within IR kinds of relations, boundary drawings, transversal relations, and so on, without the category of the international. So what categories are you going to use to do this kind of work? I don't have an answer to that. You play about with certain things to do that. But what I wanted to do, what I have prepared, is actually to go back and pick up another. I do think the question of the social and its relation to political theory, as well as the questions that João raises, because we work together around structure, the international, remain important. But I'm not going to do a going back and tell a story about IPS as a whole, but I want to pick up one particular thing, which I think was also defining at the moment, and is at the heart partly of what IPS spoke to, and which has already been mentioned, which is that it was an idea about a decentering and diffusion of power relations, political relations, and social relations. And how can you think these? So you don't think them around a center, whether it's a center of a state, whether it's the society, where things come together, where you hierarchize powers around, you know, some great powers or some alliances that sit together, but you try to let go. And how do we think? And it's not fragmentation. Decentering is not that we suddenly have all small units, because, for example, as Oliver can come back to, you know, the world order approach, some of the Luhmannian work was about creating kind of what looked like functionally differentiated things, but it had to think the whole without having a whole almost in and of itself. So it's not the same as fragmenting. It's not that you just had fragments that sat there. There was a rethinking through social theory and sociology about how you actually can think the world in a decentered way and not do it as this plurality of states that exists next to one another, which then need to be re-hierarchized under the international. So I think that was a central question. That is also how I read why Bourdieu was so important, because Bourdieu does similar things with the field, right? At some point, we all started looking, when he published the book, which I haven't read, on the state, as if everything has to come back under a major field. But you had fields on, you know, in culture, you had fields like in Didier's work on security. You could do fields in banking, I assume, or political economy or whatever. You could do these kind, because you worked with professionals or positionality in distributions of what was called capital, which was not just power. It had different kinds of capital, cultural, economic, symbolic, and so on. And you didn't have to unify. You could actually see the people. The important thing, as we'll do tomorrow morning a bit for those who can come to the school, is not that the field was a homogeneous thing. It was a distribution thing. And you could do several of these. And it's a similar way of trying to decenter. In that case, I think in Bourdieu's work, the social actually, actually in Luhmann's work, and some of Luhmann's work as well. So you do this decentering of thinking the social and political, but of power, I think was a very important part of a lineage that runs through IPS. And by all means, don't read IPS, because it was a big church. In one of the first receptions there were a lot of people, and they said, okay, we're all here together, but what do we have in common? Well, maybe, you know, we have some things in common, but it's not so easy to articulate what we all have in common. I remember these receptions, and there was a bit of talk about this, which goes way back now. But I do think there is something about this line of how to think this. Now, if you think about this, I've been thinking a bit, because I had the joy of reading Oliver's piece a bit earlier than you guys have seen it, and a bit more detail. So this change about, and I do think the question of the social is off the agenda, but in some way, if you can think how decentering worked as well, and has been working to an extent, has become an interest. One of the lines has become an increasing interest in the micro and the situated, as well as the everyday, in work that has been coming along. Now that comes much closer to some extent as you get fragmented societies, a fragmented analysis. You have highly situated analysis of specific borders, for example, specific practices of migration regulations and so on. And so they actually sit separately in it. And I think there is some development where we went, a lot of work went micro situated and so on. But that of course means then that at some point the question becomes, how do you say more than about the highly fragmented specific practices that you look at, right? How do you speak to more? And that more, of course, was, I think, originally the problem of structure, the problem of the decentering that was going on. But if you have lost in the meantime the question of structure, if that reading is correct, then you make jumps. Then you suddenly start making jumps back from, okay, so like, let's say I study a particular kind of set of detention centers to come, and from there I speak detention, and then I speak something about the global migration regime, or I work through specific benchmarking practices and numbers in banking, and I speak to, this is all an expression of neoliberal world order. So you make these huge jumps to actually giving meaning to into the micro elements, yes. But there is no, at that point, there is no theorization of how these connections work between these individual sites or practices. They can also be individual techniques of work that you study. And therefore, I do think there is a loss and there is an element, a stake in thinking the structure, specifically in thinking structure, the social, the political, in a decentering way, how we can do that. And I think originally the one was drawing on particular sociological theories to do that and to bring that in. I can't remember in the beginning, there was also an article about Benjamin. Benjamin is also a very interesting thinker in terms of doing all this kind of stuff a bit, although it's not so well articulated as in some of what were the more used theories at that time. I think that is and remains a serious, and that's where I wanted to get hopefully some discussion going in the next 3 days, is that this, I think, remains a serious puzzle within IPS and is worth taking up again. And whether we call it the social, the structural, this kind of elements together is the element. And how do we think this? And it's not that the sociology doesn't exist or that the political thinking doesn't exist around this. It's not easy necessarily. And I'll come back to a bit if I remember how they exist. But there is an other side to it where IPS, of course, since it has this lineage to critical IR, currently in the critique and criticality, there is a huge identity politics going on, where identity, whether it's racial identity, cultural identity, whatever identity it is that you have, becomes actually staked again. It's as if we have clashes of identity, as well as on the conservative side, the clashes of cultures and the cultural wars that is spoken about more and more. And you have these kinds of elements coming back and they come in, and it's very difficult to deal with them if you don't have conceptions, because they work against the decentering of it, because they actually unify groups. You become a member, you stand for something in relation to something, and it pushes back to a certain forms of essentializing thinking. Sometimes these are then connected, which you see coming back as well, is through the reinvention of grand narratives of a particular world histories that need to replace in our curriculums other histories, right? They could be histories of capitalism, they could be histories of colonization, they could be histories of the geopolitical international, but the grand histories which then actually shape the curriculum. And it makes a difference how you teach the history of IR, for example, within it. And these come together. And I think there is a stake at the moment, a serious intellectual stake, about how to engage these questions and these moves, while retaining a decentered understanding of power, the social, and relations. And therefore it is, I think, interesting. I think IPS, therefore, is a very interesting space. I mean, I would say that, of course, doing an IPS winter school, but I actually do think it's an interest, and I can see there is interest as well. We have over 100 people here, so it's not just me, I think it's a very interesting space to discuss this, because people are coming into IPS who actually are telling more about, there's a move back. I've seen it happening with some of my PhD students in Queen Mary as well. There's moves back to moving for the grand stories, because politics is again about the grand stories and the big battles that are going on. There is the element of the resurgence of identity, in a particular of identity politics that's going on. Well, at the same time, IPS offers also this puzzle about the decentering of the social and the political, right? Which works in traditions of, whether you call them deconstruction, diffusion, whatever you call them, that actually work within. And I think there are puzzles here and there are interesting instruments. And therefore, I think it is actually quite timely to look back at the lineages in IPS into the current context to set this at play in relation to one another. Because I do think IPS offers a lot of questions and resources to actually do that thinking, while at the same time, also allowing for thinking that contemporary concerns and political concerns are being re-articulated in various ways. And I haven't even spoken about interest in the planetary, what that might mean around the environmental things and so on. And I think IPS is a very interesting space, therefore, to do that work. And it has resources. It's not the case that there are no sociologies or social theories available to do that. I mean, we have mentioned the one at the beginning, but at a later moment in IPS, you have the elements coming in where there was more work. People refer to it as STS, but very often they work on actor network theory and assembling along these lines, which is an element of doing a heterogeneous structuring. Right? It's keeping a decentered notion of structuring, because it's always, small bits that move in relation to one another, all kinds of small controversies that happen, and they hook into one another, and you move out, and there are no outer boundaries. It's the movement within and the changes that go. So if you want to look at that, it is not necessarily always so articulated, but I think it would be very interesting to start articulating issues like these conceptions back into notions of social structure and political structure, of how they rethink this as inherently heterogeneous structures, but nevertheless doing some homeostatic work between them as well. That is not a kind of big, homogeneous kind of entity that exists. But there are others, there are other instruments for this available as well. I mean, that are done. But so these do exist, I think, and I therefore think that there is an interesting space within IPS, and I think it is politically very central at the moment. As maybe I'm a bit over-biased by being in the UK and Saxon world, but generally I think there is more to this. Then you see a resurgence of people moving back, and you see publications in IR coming back as well. The need on the critique side for new articulations of totalities, that you can read the individual instances through the grand global struggles, whether they're about capitalism, whether about geopolitics or whatever that is. And you do see coming back a highly cultural politics and identitarian politics, which works for me against the deconstructive, decentering, diffusion critical tradition from which IPS comes. And there I work with João on this. I do think that speaks to Oliver's problem of the social and the political, that is that the loss of the category of structure is actually very important here. And the way of thinking structure in a decentered, diffused, heterogeneous way of multiplicity that is not fragmenting in the sense that you end up with fragments, which then of course invites against the dialectics towards integration. Yeah. So you got fragments, how do you integrate them? And then you understand them in relation to either the fragments generate the integrated, or the integrated allows you to understand the significance of the fragments. But that's why we speak about fracturing as a line of thought. But another line of thinking, this is transversalizing. Some people think multiplicities and so on. But in the element, the multiplicities are not about pluralistic things existing next to one another. They are about ways of thinking, heterogeneous processes and so on in relation to one another. So they exist together in a relational way. And so I think for me, IPS is an important place. And I do think there is quite a lot of interest currently in IPS among, shall we call them new generations, new developments. And I think part of the reason for that is that it actually keeps these questions on the table, which I think are actually quite central questions, both for academically for us, but also for us in IR, but also in other disciplines, actually, if you look what's going on in some parts of sociology, some parts of anthropology, human geography, and so on, they're important there as well. But I also think they're politically important stakes at the moment that are being played out in the world. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that gives enough for discussion. So João, back to you.
Thanks, Jef. You were very disciplined with time. Oliver, do you want to reply, react, or should we open to the public?
As you prefer. I mean, I have some notes and could react, but I'm also happy for others to talk first. I mean, you're the boss.
Oh, okay. I'm the boss. Why don't you react first?
Okay, thanks. I mean, thanks for your presentations. I think they are very, very crucial and very, very important, and also very inspiring thoughts and ideas here, which I would love to discuss, and maybe also after the panel and in the years to come. But so let me try to summarize. I think what we're talking about is, and I might be wrong, so but has IPS the critical and reflexive capacities to actually think about the social in the international, or the international in the as social terms? Now, we had, I think in your presentations, I think there are three critical or four critical or principal points to be had. The first is the genealogy, or the how IPS was framed and forged, the inclusions and the exclusions. And you both pointed out that it is embedded or firmly inscribed into the critical project of the 80s and 90s. Now, I totally agree. And also, I think that IPE has been essentially sidelined, is of course one of the things that I've been working on for the last 15 years. That's exactly the point. But I will come back to this later. But I just want to, and I don't want to, I mean, at the same time, even though I love the Muppet Show, I don't want to be Waldorf or Statler at the moment, but I might sound like it. So apologies. But for those who don't know the Muppet Shows, these are the old elder guy on the balcony who always are very critical and make fun of everybody and are very cynical. But I don't want to be cynical, but I do think, and it's an unease when I hear critical today, because everybody's critical and everything is critical. And I think critical, there is a change in the meaning. I mean, I cannot point it out, and maybe Rob can guide us, but I mean, critical in the 80s and 90s was something about changing the discipline and changing the kind of understanding the world order. Even if you take the classic from Rob Cox, when it's standing the forces and the boundary drawing practices, as you've referred. Critical for me today means critical actually means we need a critical approach, means a normative better position my opponent, which puts you also always in a very difficult position to have a discussion, because you already know that your opponent is wrong because he's not critical. And that's why we actually live in a very Kafkaesque world, move forward by deconstruction. We always move forward by having another approach, another grandfather of social theory, predominantly French, who is then simply applied to issues of international relations. But the very question about whether it is possible to, I mean, just referring to what Jef said about the state in Bourdieu, and I think, yeah, he was in the end. I mean, there was this state. So how can you apply Bourdieu and talk about the world as a field without the state? I mean, it's not a discussion about it. is for me intellectual lazy. And it's just, I mean, okay, I mean, Bourdieu is interesting. Let's talk about how it makes sense to reconstruct problems of the international in terms of fields without having a state. What do you take away? How do you actually work through that? Today, and that's what you say, I mean, IPS is also very fractured when I take that along these, where it says debates only take place in order to show that my grand social theorist is better than yours. So I engage with X, Y, Z in order to show that I was right in the beginning. And then you have these little groups who always then talk about among each other, but do not actually address the big questions. And practice theories are my favorite animal when it comes to that, because I mean, don't get me started. I can talk half an hour and get around, but I don't. I want to be civilized. That points me to the second question, which is the structural forces within IR. I think out to a very interesting point when you mentioned governmentality, because I think doing that kind of reconstruction would allow us to see how, for example, Foucault was translated into IR and what the structural basis, and you will see probably governmentality that was very, very structuralist way. And it was very connotative with spatial categories, where you also national versus the global versus the transnational, the local, the micro, and whatever have you. But there's also a temporal aspect in that, because pastoral power moved from the church to the state by having an open and unknown future, which I would say we currently see the end of, because we know how our future world looks like. And we start to think about politics from the back, from global warming, for example, and we know the scenarios and we know how much carbon we can exhale. So you get a very eschatological argument back into politics, where you see that in central bank discourses, for example, they now need to make sense of how prices work, how carbon works, how monetary policy works, when the future is not open and unknown, but it's actually known, because we know what will happen with 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, or 3 degrees. So you see a completely shift of the argument. And then the question is, what happens with pastoral power? What happens with the social compromises that we have in among groups? So I think you pointed out to a very, very important structural force, which I think also explains why we have this inscription of geography and space, because probably IR is a very spatially thinking discipline, because we used to think in space, translate that into new avenues. Maybe that's a question. What Jef said about diffusion in the micro, I just want to, and I'm not sure whether I completely agree. I would just say that there is maybe a danger that the local or the micro is taken as local. But of course, you have global microstructures. When you look at trading, for example, it's all micro, but it's global. So that, and so, see, there is a tendency today to assume that what is local and everyday is the true rock bottom that we actually can build on. But just 2 caveats, and maybe just two questions what you think about it. And well, first of all, what I always find more important is not just what is happening, but what is not happening. What are the practices and the everydays and what that are excluded, silenced, outside, not even possible. And every social order is actually stabilized by a higher complexity of that is not than actually taking place. And I think that boundary is still relevant and it's still operational, even when we look at everyday practices that are then somehow the new data of from where we can build social things. Second is, even in the everyday, at one point in time, you will deal or operate with abstractions, analogies, metaphors, collective singulars. You will talk about the market, the subject, the state, sovereignty, that are all always undefinable, inexplicable, beyond the everyday. And I think one of the tasks of IPS is still to understand what these abstractions for abstraction operate on the international, and how they are performed. I mean, if you say that's a problem of market failure or the market, then you already perform it because you already tell, or you already distribute the problem to economists who can tell us how the market works. It's not the lawyer and it's not the anthropologist who tells us how a market failure is to be fixed. So there is this bias and there is the structural power operational. So I just say, as much as I loved what you said, and I agree, I would like to know more about what you think about the excluded, the silenced, and the logic of abstractions. And I thank you. That's my reaction.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks a lot for these reflections. There's a bit from your talk that was cut a little bit, so we might get back to you on a few details. There was a small interference there in your transmission. Let's open for more questions, and then we can react to both Oliver's comments and to questions from the public.
João, I think the chat is closed, so I think we'll need to open the chat.
Is it open?
Renata, we can also use hands, putting hands up if that works. Because I see Rachel has her hand up, if I'm correct. We can also use that one.
I think now it's open, yeah.
Rahel, do you want to?
Yes, please.
Yep.
Yeah, I just had, I don't have a question for Oliver, but it was just a comment on something that Jef said, that if I understood it correctly, his comment about identity politics, that by maybe focusing on it, we would be kind of doing a disservice to IPS, or like, you know, maybe fragmenting it too much in a way. I mean, that's kind of the gist of I got it. Please correct me if I misinterpreted. But it is my opinion that identity politics only becomes political when non-white people do politics. And in that sense, I think what might be phrased as identity politics is indeed a kind of deconstruction of how, you know, social political economy is manifested in the social in ways or against persons who do not fall into the hegemonic masculine, basically, right? And the hegemonic masculine being, you know, the obvious kind of white, older male, middle to high class, educated, heterosexual type of person. Whereas by deconstructing, you know, the terms in which identity politics might be constructed or, you know, discursively analyzed, would be part of a process of decolonizing or deconstructing culture. And I say this because within my own research, I'm interrogating this whole idea of cultural difference when it comes to negotiation practices, negotiation theory, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the ways in which we analyze negotiating strategies conducted from the global South, that it isn't cultural difference that causes negotiation deadlock or tension. It is in fact colonial difference, right? When it comes to identity or cultures that some people have a problem with, it seems to fall more on the lines of, race or gender, a combination of all these things, of course, if we're going to use an intersectional perspective. But yeah, to keep my comment short, I think we need to just replace cultural difference with colonial difference and, move on to deconstruct how colonial structures continue to perpetuate a lot of the problems we see in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahel. Beto?
Hi, thank you so much for all your contributions and for sharing us so much. Also, thanks to Harel for her point that also connects to some of the interests that I wanted to share with you. I want to link in a way what Harel has said about colonial difference in relation to what I understood Oliver was referring to when he mentioned his second point about the logic of abstractions. So I was thinking here in terms of the so-called more recent ontological term in decolonial studies. So the work of Marisol de la Cadena and some others that in many ways not only problematize the ontological conception of the world as a one world, but also how with this problematization, this broader conceptual framework within which worlds and cosmovisions are indistinguishable from, they play in many ways this more structural bias, if I understood Oliver was pointing to. So one could think in a way in a post-structural reading of language, right? How the international state sovereignty and so many other abstract forms, political forms are interconnected, right? So in this sense, I wonder how, going back to a certain post-structural reading of language and relating that to this kind of, if I understood, structural problematization of the logic of abstractions, concepts, categories, assumptions, right? There is a certain politics of language, a broader politics of language, right? That is also, or has also to involve a broader reading and conception of the politics of translation, understood here in a certain way, right? That in many ways has to do with, on the one hand, what these decolonial studies would call us to think about the pluriversal political ontology of a world of many worlds, but also the so important boundaries and limits of the international that is so important for IPS, right? So in this sense, my 2 points trying to synthesize is how IPS has been responding or not to post-colonial and decolonial studies. And on the other hand, how it has, most especially considering the connection between the international, the social and the political, with some, and I know that Oliver, I think, was related to at least one of these projects that tried to bring translation as an important thing to think in international relations, and I would say IPS. So how IPS would respond to both decolonial, post-colonial studies, and a certain link and a certain reading of the politics of language and the politics of translation. If one think about what I understood Oliver was putting forward in terms of the logic of abstractions.
Thank you, Beto. Anyone else?
João, there is a question in the chat by Alessandro Biazzi.
Okay. Okay, Alessandro Biazzi. It is clear that in the IPS project, both the field of security and the dialogue with the R discipline prevail, at least in emphasis. How do you panelists analyze the same type of relationship if we take into account economic sociology, economic problems, and the critique of the international political economy? Would this dialogue with the economical be present via the dialogue with geography? If you could indicate in your answers possible analysis of banks, development, finance, or concepts or authors that emphasize economic sociology and IPS would be great. Okay, thank you, Alessandro, for that question. Anyone else? Okay, so back to Jef then.
Yeah, can I come back to the decentering, diffusion, and so on that's there? Why I think that IPS is a space to have the debates around, as the issues are raised now around identity and the colonial, but precisely because it has work and is connected to work that does the decentering and puts it central. And I will say that I don't agree that identity only emerges when it's the non-white male and so on. Identity, if you go back into IR, was an element that came in where one actually was on the back of a turn towards the discursive, the cultural, and so on. One started reading foreign policy as an analysis of identity politics, which were not necessarily racialized or not necessarily cultural in that sense, or colonized. So there were discussions about that going on. What I think, therefore, is in the decentering element is that it is the question, and that's the tension in identity thinking, between rethinking multiplicity and heterogeneity and how that actually relates to identity thinking and what that does to the categories of identity. There are traditions and elements where you actually, the Deleuzian work is all about difference, not between identities, but difference as such, that you try to think, and how do you try to think that? And you might say, so I think in keeping these questions alive, it also asks critical questions back to issues people are concerned with and through which they re-articulate and shut down questions like culture becomes related to a particular meaning of culture, identity to a particular meaning, multiplicity and pluriverses become related to a particular history of world history, which is the world history of colonialism. But if you read work by Anat Singh, or if you read work by Anne-Marie Moll, multiplicity also exists in the hospital as a different kind of visions of the disease, of a particular disease that coexist, not in contradiction, not in opposition, but they are not homogeneous and the same either. They are actually incoherent, but they nevertheless do the work that is being done in various ways. So there are ways of thinking that, and that's what I think why the questions that need to be retained, whether they are the very absolute, but they're not so out there conceptual puzzles around multiplicity and so on that needs to think. And I do think IPS has this long history that keeps an element of not necessarily a red flag, but at least a question mark when conceptual categories are become essentialized and hooked back into whether it's a particular understanding of one history, a particular understanding of what identity politics can be, a particular understanding of what culture can be, a particular understanding of what the relationship of encounters and connections, through which some colonial thought is a post-colonial thought and decolonial thought is taught, how you think that, not through ontologizing, but more epistemologically as how points of view moved into one another. And therefore you don't have points of view that are pure anymore at all. You only have the points of view meeting and things that happen in that. And I think that is why I think that discussion and the current concerns around identity, culture, and so on, why IPS is a fruitful space to actually keep this discussion going, because it has other references to the same problematic around multiplicity, identity, and so on. I also quickly come back to Oliver. Oliver, I didn't mean to say that the micro is there. What I think the micro is there, and the micro is not the local. But what I try to say is that, but one does the micro the local, therefore the global is reified and brought back in to make sense of the local if you have to stitch them together. But the macro problem is a big thinking through that has happened in many disciplines, among others in sociology. And you have I remember when we were reading about this for the piece on structure that we did, I saw an edited book by Norsedien and a few others on the macro problem. This was the 1980s, and they were rethinking and all the, when actor network theory and SDS became fashionable. Well, the way they dealt with macro is in that book. And it is well placed in how it's done. So I think these questions are the questions that need to be retained. And therefore, they're there. And the same with the everyday. The everyday is often used as the bedrock, the authentic, the natural, or also the local or the small practices that do things. But the everyday is an analytical category that's been used in different ways. Like Goffman uses it different from the Certeau, for example, or uses it different from other people, from what were the people from the Alltagsgeschichten in Germany, for example, or from Lefebvre. So there are different ways, but these analytical categories do something in terms of how you understand social and political and the politics that happens through the social that takes place. So I do think it's important to retain these categories and read them in that way, rather than just say, the micro is there and situate, and that's the bedrock. I think it's exactly not the bedrock. They are the categories through which one makes an interference in particular situations through which to do. And then the final point, and that is the big puzzle, I think that is an ambivalence in IPS for me. This is the same thing as Jens Bartelson's critique of the state. There is no escaping the state if you think politics in relation to the state. So you're always locked back into that tradition of thought, right? So there's no way out, even if you critique it at that point. So the critique is what, because the concept does the work for you in its element. And that's the same for the international. So if you want to think relations, let's say at the scale of, we can't say the world but before the world or something, right? Where you don't, how do you think these processes and relations in relation? And that's, I think, what the problematic of transversality is. One of the elements that is filled in. That is, how do you think these relations that exist and that constitute lives and so on, that take place without having to speak the international all the time? Because once you speak it, you're actually often drawn back in, as you say. How can you speak about the international if you can't speak about it? How can you not speak about the state? Well, in some way, maybe it's enough to do the transnational field of police cooperation to understand how something like the internal security field in Europe came together, of how intelligence functions, across the world, in some relations between this, not just states, but between the professionals and so on. So maybe that's enough without having to bring in all the time back again. Oh, and how does that connect to the international or to the state? And that's an element within IPS. I think that's a tension between what we try as the oxymoron, I think is an oxymoron, to speak about transversalizing the international, as we try to do, organize some panels around that, about transversalizing the international. Because in some way, I think you lose the international in that way. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing either in IPS, if IPS remains an intellectual space where you can have these discussions without then naively saying, oh, the international doesn't exist anymore. Like João said, it will come back at us at some point, of course, as well, if depending on what you look at. But that's what I said, that's, I think, is the paradox of always bringing the international as the central category back to it. And so I think sometimes it's nicer, like, go through the transnational into the transversal, and what is the difference with the way people talk transnationalism? And you think it now in terms of transversal connections, in terms of fields. Is there a difference between these two, right? And what does it do? And that might be enough, maybe as well, for some people to do bits of that work. So in other words, we don't always have to think the big order necessarily, yeah?
Thanks, Jef. Just a few short comments on the questions and the observations by Oliver. I think the question of critique Oliver raised is has been, in our minds, both Jef and mine, for a while. And I think the challenge of critique has a lot to do with, in IPS at least, with a few elements I raised when I talk about how it evolved in its analytical and research project. So as a field that's been relatively successful, I think, in establishing itself in international studies, international relations as a field, IPS has normalized itself in a way. It has established certain analytical dispositions, certain authors everybody is attached to. And as such, it has, codified a little bit what it means to do critique in international relations. So I think it's part of the constitution of fields in general, right? To establish a certain, doxa, if you want, or a certain knowledges that are more or less accepted by the field in general. And of course, there the difference between criticism and critique becomes blurred. Right? And in IPS, it's not different. A lot of what comes as critique at times is an instantiation or a reproduction of what we've talked about, right? Of establishing what the limits of the international are, establishes boundary practices that are delegitimized in some way, the kinds of violences that occur in certain places that are not visible. So these are all, standard critical practices, if you want, that have more or less become established in the field. So, but of course, the challenge of critique is to bring on creatively new ways of thinking, right? The challenge of critique is to think and not just to reproduce certain styles of thinking or certain categories. And that's something every field faces. And of course, in order to think, sometimes you have to innovate in areas that are marginal to the field. So, and that's always a problem. So what happens at times in IR and IPS is that in order to innovate critically, people choose certain authors, certain perspectives, and defend them as perhaps the new way of doing critique. What Jef and I try to do is the ethos of critique in IPS has to be always about the way we look at the political as multiple and heterogeneous. That's something that's always destabilizing established forms of thought, or if you want, images of thought that are more or less established. So what we try to do is to challenge IPS into at least thinking differently from all these, if you want, ways in which the international creeps back in, right? And offers us some kind of social whole from which we can think about discriminations, violences, authorizations, and so forth. So that's what we try to do. So we try actually to avoid, right, or at least avoid is not a good word, but at least to stimulate new ways of thinking that will perhaps help us not to reproduce the dominant practice in the field. So that's more or less what critique is. And the sectarianism has become, very prevalent today in the field of IR. And I think that's just an expression of what critique has become, a form of negativity, basically. Right? The dominant way of doing critique is through the notion that you can overcome the established order through negation. Right, and that's why certain Marxist notions of totality are coming back. That's certain notions of imperialism and so forth are coming back, because you have to negate what's over there by representing it as a more or less coherent logic, or more or less coherent intellectual current. So that produces a lot of sectarianism, I would say, a lot of antagonism. And at the origins of the field, of our field, is an ethos of being more pluralistic, I'd say, more pragmatism. Pragmatism is really at the heart of the project, I would say, intellectually speaking, not politically speaking. And what you raised about the closeness to geography in the beginning, I think it has a lot to do, right, with these big categories that critical geography tried to deconstruct or to criticize in the 90s, especially. So that was perhaps that in part explains the closeness of IPS to critical geography journals, and why it was so read by critical geographers. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but a lot of their agendas at that time was very close to what IPS was trying to do. And in answer to Beto and to Alessandro, well, I think Jef has already addressed in part what Beto raised, but you said, what is our answer to the colonial critique? I'm not sure we have an answer, or we need to give an answer. I'm not sure what the question is, right? The question posed by, which question are you referring to when you say what's the answer to the colonial critique? I think IPS, tries to raise questions more than give answers. So IPS, I think it's a site of intervention from where to think about relations of power, processes that are going on, offering a different analytics. And coloniality has always been present in the journal, right? Even more present in the current term, especially in the journal, led by Debbie, Vicky, and others. The thing is, how do we interrogate what you call coloniality? These kinds of mode, this mode of domination, right? How is it reproduced, instantiated, right? Where does it emerge from? What are the connections that allow for a colonial logic to emerge in certain areas? What I would resist is to say that the international is the colonial, because if we're going to criticize the international, right, as an expression of colonial project, and it certainly is, we have to criticize the notion of the colonial itself, because we cannot offer the colonial as a critical answer to the problem of modernity and the problem of the international. So coloniality in itself is a problem and is a category that expresses a problem. And I'm not sure how it, we've all discussed decolonial thought at length. But I think, if we're going to engage with decolonial thought, we have to engage with, the limits of, for instance, Latin American decolonial thought, and how it thinks about global modernity. That's really problematic, right? And how it cannot dissociate itself from a certain political economy of the global world system. So, but there are many interventions we can make with decolonial thought, depending on what is the problem. I think the thing is, what problems are we trying to engage in with decolonial thought? Right? And there's lots. If you take the work of Arturo Escobar about social movements and networks and territoriality, very, very fruitful, very interesting intervention on the way you can think about social movements and resistance from what we call the periphery. But again, many people and again, the coloniality is very plural. There's all kinds of colonial thought. But one of the problems is, some post-colonials and decolonials, at times reinstantiate the division between North and South. I think that's not very helpful. Or to bring back imperialism, but that's a point of view, right? I think that's a way we intervene in the debate. Sorry. So that's one thing. And to Alessandro, political economy. Clearly, IPS doesn't want to do IPE. I mean, these are two different fields. But there are a lot of people in IPS who address. Oliver is here. He probably can address the question better than I can. How does IPS deal with questions of finance development? I think Oliver is the guy. You asked for some references. Certainly, Oliver is one of the guys who can give you a proper answer. But certainly, there's a lot of work. You take the work of oh God, what's her name? Jacqueline Best, for instance. She discusses development finance from the perspective of international political sociology. The thing is, what are the knowledges, the practices, what are the dispositions that enable certain institutions, certain social groups to define certain economic relations as a problem of governance, for instance, right? Why is good governance based on certain economic logics? So that's what interest IPS. Why has development become a way of governing less developed people or post-colonial states, right? Instead of what economic theory used to say, a way out of the colonial condition, right? Now development is a way to govern, the poor populations of the world. So all these questions are more like, what kind of practices are involved in political economy? They're articulated to a political sociology of power relations for instance, in global governance. But there's lots. Jackie Best is one reference I would give you. Oliver is here. I would say, Jesus, no other name comes to mind. Perhaps Oliver can give us more suggestions.
Sure. Well, I mean, we're coming to a close, so I want to be brief. I mean, we talked about many things, and I think the one thing that I think and hope that this panel can convey is that to do IPS is promising, but it's bloody hard work. And I'm not sure everybody who considers working in IPS lives up to the task of doing the work and not being just lazy by having read a couple of books by one favorite social theorist and that for the rest of your lives. There is IPS as a field, which is thriving, which is plural, which is then also in a very awkward relationship to the journal. The journal is important as the identity and self-description of the field, but as I was asking Jef in a different setting, I would be interested to see what kind of IPS would come up when we did all the ISA papers and doing IPS roundtables papers together, and put that in a conjunction or in opposition to what the journal looks like, and not as a critique of the journal, but to understand what gets published and what gets not published, and where does this what gets not published in IPS, where does this actually end up? I would like to know. Just a minute. I think it doesn't make sense to separate economy from the social and the political. An IPE at the moment operates on the political economy, but excludes the social, which I think is blind. And IPS could embrace more questions of economy to actually understand some of the inequalities and biases that are operational in the world. That being said, decolonial is important, but I think there's a certain danger equating IPS with a certain political project. of course, it's fair and legitimate to say that a certain political project should be more progressive and should be more valued. And I mean, I have difficulties in arguing anything. Well, first of all, I'm arguing against it because that's what I teach, that's what I love. But I am this middle class white man. I deconstruct myself, and I would be off some other thing. That's not helpful. So I would rather let the others speak and listen. When it comes to that, the only 2 points here is that I will invite you from moving also from the project of deconstruction to the problem of construction. So what is the politics of actually, what would the world look like where this, what are the political processes and how can we build structures or infrastructures where this bias and inequality are actually more separated, more into what the subaltern tried to do. So what is the problem of construction here? And all I say is that be patient also with that other political projects exist, which I think are also important, especially when it comes to structural inequalities and poverty. And also there is the politics of it's important. Nobody doubts relevance. And certainly there is a lot of more work to do, but there are also other political projects that can flourish in. That's all I have to say. But thanks for the Greek. There is this special IPS and IPE. Came out 2 years ago, I think, in international relations, where we thought about remittances and others, which also remittances are linked to human trafficking, linked to post-colonial things, but our activity and thinking through remittances, for example, Achel Kunz does tremendous work there. Through these feminist and decolonial and post-colonial categories is very helpful. But there's more work to be done. I mean, and there is work to be done. There is the colonial PE is massive, and there are many who go with this world or with the concept. I try to think through risk and interests where that are racialized and do that same. But one point that I wanted to say that is that it's not only about the past, but it's also about the future. And that's where the structural imbalances come in. So I think the post-colonial critique is also about the possible futures that are available. And these are structured by concepts that you talk in and think through practices or processes or relations. And so I think the conceptual work needs to be done because that's one of the sides of politics. But as I said, I'm just a little light there, and I would rather let others speak here because they're have far more interesting things to say here.
Thanks so much, Oliver. Well, I think if there is no other intervention, we can come to the close of this first panel about the histories, trajectories, and challenges of IPS. We'll continue tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow with Didier Bigot, Rob Walker, and Uli Weaver will be here. And on Thursday, Debbie Lyle, Nicole Grove, and Kyle Grayson. Okay, thanks, you guys. See you in the virtual cocktail, I hope, for those of you who are with us in the mornings or tomorrow. Sorry?
When is the cocktail? Is it right away? Or is it in an hour?
In an hour.
Oh, okay, because there is a football game going on, Spain against
Italy. I know, yeah. But Germany lost already, right, Oliver? You know.
Yeah, well, we're supposed to lose. I mean, it's our history. Better we lose. I don't like Germany win. Very dangerous.
Well, we don't like Germany winning
Also, when
either.
Germans try
Here
to
in
be funny,
Brazil,
not
especially.
very- it's seldom understood and has bad consequences. So yeah, in an hour. Okay, thanks. And I watched
Thanks,
the game.
Oliver, so much for
Yeah.
participating in the
Thanks for
panel.
having me. And
Thanks,
thanks for all the
everyone.
questions.